This episode is brought to you by my favorite sponsor, CuriosityStream. CuriosityStream is a subscription streaming service that offers thousands of non-fiction movies and shows from some of the world's best filmmakers, including exclusive originals. It has millions of subscribers and new shows every week on history, science, tech, military history, and, of course, true crime. And it's extremely affordable at under $20 a year. For those of you who are interested, I can recommend a few titles like Murder Maps, a drama doc-series that takes you back in time to the most shocking and surprising murder cases in history, or The Man Nobody Knew, about the hidden life of legendary CIA spy master William Colby. The consummate American soldier spy, Colby took on the government's dirtiest assignments without question, until the day he defied presidential orders and revealed to Congress the CIA's family jewels. I also like the Curious Minds series on terrorism and espionage. CuriosityStream is available worldwide on their web app, Roku, Android, Xbox One, smart TVs, iOS, Chromecast, Amazon Fire, Amazon Kindle, and Apple TV. So go to curiositystream.com/skd for unlimited access to the world's top documentaries and nonfiction series. Use promo code SKD and you'll save 25%. That's only $14.99 a year. It's basically what I pay on Netflix per month. At $1.25 per month, you actually owe me a like on the video for this deal. Now let's get back to Peeping Tom's serial killers and all the good stuff. Robert Black never knew his parents. When Jessie Hunter Black gave birth to her son on the 21st of April, 1947, she refused to put his father's name on the birth certificate. And Jessie, 24 and unmarried, earning a meager amount as a factory worker, was really in no position to care for an illegitimate baby, still a stigma in 1947. Within days of Robert's birth, Jessie decided to have him fostered. Years later, Robert Black, by this time a man in his 40s, told psychologists Ray Wire, "I don't know whether it was pressure from her parents or whether she just didn't want me. I don't know. I was fostered at 6 months." Within the year, Jessie had married. She and her husband, Francis Hall, were to have 4 children together, none of whom were told they had a half-brother, and to emigrate to Australia, where Jessie died in 1982. Francis Hall's niece, Joyce Bonella, recalls that Jessie didn't like it to be generally known that she had a child out of wedlock. "I don't think she ever told anyone who the father was." From the time that she gave Robert up, Jessie never had any contact with her son again. While Jessie was settling into married life, Robert was being cared for by his new family. Jack and Margaret Tulip were both in their 50s and had fostered children on several occasions previously. Robert had been born in Grangemouth, about 20 miles from Edinburgh, on the Firth of Forth. The Tulips lived in Kinlochleven, near Glencoe in the West Highlands. Robert lived here for the next 11 years, the majority of which were spent in the care of Margaret Tulip, as Jack died when Robert was just 5. Black claims to have no memory of him, indeed no memories at all before the age of 5. To Ray Wire, this unusual memory block suggests the presence and repression of some sort of emotional or physical trauma Black had been subjected to as an infant, probably at the hands of his foster father. After all, Wire says, most of us can recall something, some vague, impressionistic sense of who we were before we were 5. Although locals remember how Robert Black was frequently heavily bruised as a boy, Black himself cannot recall how he got these injuries. He recalls no abusive behavior from Jack, though he does remember how Margaret used to lock him in the house as a punishment for bad behavior, or alternatively, pull down his trousers and underwear and spank him with a belt. At nights, Robbie was scared that there was a monster under his bed waiting to get him, and used to suffer from a recurring nightmare featuring a big hairy monster in a cellar full of water. When he awoke, he frequently found that he had wet the bed, which invariably provoked a beating. To his classmates at primary school, Robert, or Smelly Robert Tulip as he was known, is remembered as having been an aggressive and slightly wayward boy. A bit of a loner but with a tendency to bully, was how one old primary school mate, Colin McDougall, put it. It seems that Black didn't mix in with the normal playground games, preferring to spend time with children younger than himself who he could easily dominate. As Colin McDougall also remembers, we had a gang, but he insisted on being leader of his own gang. The members were always a couple of years younger than him. Another classmate, Jimmy Mines, remembers an incident where Black gave a boy with an artificial leg a beating. He gave the poor lad a terrible hammering. He just jumped on top of him as he was walking over the bridge to school one day. Black just punched and kicked him for no reason. Suddenly, mindless violence perpetrated against those physically less able than himself was typical of Black as a boy. As he grew older, his reputation as a bit of a ruffian grew. The local bobby, Sandy Williams, later said that Black was a wild wee laddie who didn't give a damn, no respect for authority. He had a dangerous spirit and needed a smack round the ear to keep him in line. Having said this, in the period that he was living with the Tulips, Robert never really got himself in any serious trouble. He had childish fights, played up at school, and bullied the younger children. Yet he seemed to avoid anything more serious than a rebuke from Williams for swearing in front of ladies. In addition to this propensity for petty violence, Black was also developing a precocious sexual self-awareness. Years later, Black remembers the emergence of a practice which began while he was living with the Tulips and would continue and intensify as he matured. "I used to push things up my anus," Black told Wire. "I was 8 years old." When asked what objects he would use, Black replied, holding his fingers about 8 inches apart, that it was usually a little piece of metal. After his arrest in 1990, police found photographs that Black had taken of himself. One showed him with a wine bottle up his anus, another with a telephone handset, yet another with a table leg. Black explained to the incredulous officers that he wanted to see just how much he could fit up there. At around the same age, Black also remembers fantasizing about excreting on his hands and then rubbing the feces in. He also always had an uneasy feeling that he would have preferred to have been a girl, although there was certainly nothing feminine about his behavior. He simply hated his penis and would have preferred to have had a vagina. We have here a nice inversion of the usual Freudian model. Whereas women envy men in the presence of the penis, whereas the lack or absence that Black experienced all of his life was that of the vagina. His lifelong practice of self-penetration seems to have been an enactment of this vagina envy. But he was by no means homosexual in his desires. Not only did his autoerotic sex life begin early, so did his experimentation with the opposite sex. His first sexual experience, which is one of his first memories, was when he was only 5. Black vividly recalls himself and a little girl undressing and looking at each other's sexual parts. Then, at the age of 7, at his Highland dance classes, he remembers being far more interested in lying on the floor and looking up the girl's skirts than dancing. At the age of 8, while looking after a neighbor's baby, he took off her nappy to look at her vagina. Both vaginas and anuses fascinated him, and he was obsessed with discovering how big they were, how much they could hold. It's interesting to speculate what he was looking for. What could the orifices hold that he might discover? To search the vagina for some large hidden content is like a regressive version of the fantasy of searching for the origins of the self. If one looks up there, knowing how much it will hold, might one not encounter the ultimate secret? The baby, oneself? For one who had never known his parents, never had access to his birth mother, and may subsequently have been abused, what a compelling obsession to look into that darkness to see what it might have contained. There is the further fascination, of course, with the anus, which may be thought of as a thanatos to the eros of the vagina. But a child's first fantasies are cloacal. It's the hole that fascinates, and the functions are not so closely differentiated in infantile fantasy. As the child grows more self-aware, the anus, of course, is differentiated as the remover of waste, though it may continue to exercise its old childish fascinations. So much so that Freud calls an entire personality type, formed around a matrix of characteristics such as tightness and the tendency to withhold emotion, the anal personality type. That Black was universally characterized as messy and smelly his entire adult life also suggests some further manifestation of his compulsion to play about with the dirty part of himself. Margaret Tulip died in 1958. It was the worst possible thing that could have happened. Black was only 11 and was once again deprived of a mother. Although a local couple offered to take him in, it was decided that Black would go to the Reading Children's Home near Falkirk, close to the place of his birth. It was during Black's time there that his fascination with sex, and particularly with the vagina, finally drove him across the line from childish experimentation to criminal behavior. The fascination with the secret of birth, the hidden contents of the womb, was clearly exacerbated by the loss of his second mother. At the age of 12, Black made his first inept attempt at non-consensual sex. He told Ray Wire, "Me and 2 other boys went into a field with a girl the same age. We took her knickers off, lifted her skirt, and all tried to put our penises in. Finding that they couldn't complete the act of penetration, the boys contented themselves instead with touching the girl's vagina. When asked if she was consenting to this, Black told Wire, 'I was forcing her, like, you know?' The incident was exposed and the authorities decided that Black would be better suited to a home with stricter discipline, not to mention an all-male environment. Black was on the move again, this time to the Red House in Musselburgh. Here, having been sent away as an abusive, Black swiftly found that he had changed roles. For at least a year, possibly 2, one of the 3 that Black was at the Red House, a male member of staff, now dead, regularly abused him. The man's custom, apparently, when the time approached for his current victim to leave, was to force him to recommend another boy to take his place. Robert Black was recommended. Black later described the form that the abuse took. "The man," he said, "made me put his penis in my mouth. Touch him, you know. He did try to bugger me once, but he couldn't get an erection." Even before this time at the Red House, Black had associated sex with dominance and submission. This association was now cemented in his mind. Now in the position of victim himself, he empathized and identified with his abuser. From the abuse perpetrated upon him, Black concluded that it was acceptable to take what you wanted without regard to other people's feelings. During this time, Robert had obtained a place at Musselburgh Grammar School. He was slightly above average academically, but it was sport that he was really interested in, especially football, swimming, and athletics. When he later moved to London in his early 20s, he was given a trial for Enfield Town. Unfortunately, his poor eyesight put a career in professional football beyond his reach. His love of swimming continued throughout his adult life, and he even worked as a lifeguard for a time, which was ideal fuel for his pedo fantasies. As a boy at the Red House, Robert often walked from Musselburgh to nearby Portobello, where there were 2 swimming pools in which he would practice. Over 20 years later, a little girl called Carolyn Hogg was to be abducted from Portobello and later murdered. Carolyn's house was on the route between the 2 swimming pools. In the summer of 1962, when Black was 15, his time at the Red House was up. With some help from the authorities, Black got a job as a delivery boy and found a room to rent in a boys' home in Greenock outside Glasgow. He later admitted that while he was doing his delivery rounds, he abused 30 or 40 girls. He told Ray Wire that, "If there was a girl on her own in the flats where I was delivering, I'd sit down and talk to her for a few minutes, and try to touch her. Sometimes succeeded, sometimes not. Amazingly, none of this behavior seems to have been officially reported, and it was not until a year later that Black's first conviction came about. The charge was for lewd and libidinous behavior with a young girl. It should have been for attempted murder. Black, who is now 17, had approached a 7-year-old girl in the park, asking her if she'd like to go with him to see some kittens. The girl trustingly followed him as he led her to a deserted building. Black told Ray Wire that, "I took her inside and I held her down on the ground with my hands round her throat. I must have half strangled her or something because she was unconscious. When she was quiet, I took her knickers off and I lifted her up so as I was holding her behind her knees and her vagina was wide open, and I poked my finger in there once."
He then laid her down on the floor and masturbated over her inert body. Her lack of consciousness, far from detracting from his pleasure, enhanced it. When he left the girl in that derelict building, he didn't know, nor it seems care, whether she was unconscious or dead. She was later found wandering the streets, bleeding, crying, and confused. The case was brought to court and astoundingly, Black was given an admonishment, a verdict particular to Scottish law which is effectively no more than a warning to be on good behavior in the future. A naive psychiatric report had been prepared for the court, which said that the event was an isolated one, highly unlikely to recur or to mar Black's normal development. Thus, by the time he was 17, Black had attempted to force one girl to have sex, left another for dead, abused many others, and got away with it. Unlike the psychiatric report, however, the Social Services Probation Report viewed the incident as more serious, and it was decided that Black should leave Greenock and return to Grangemouth to make a new start. Here he got a job with a builder's supply company and rented a room with an older couple. He also met his first, and last, real girlfriend. According to Black, Pamela Hodgson and he fell in love, developed a sexual relationship, and decided to get engaged. Years later, he still remembers the devastation he felt when a letter arrived from Pamela after some months, telling him that it was over. Perhaps she had heard some of the gossip that was circulating about her boyfriend and his sexual preferences, or indeed that she was beginning to experience them at first hand. In 1992, after Black had been served with 10 summonses, including 3 for the murder of 3 little girls, in an attempt to shift the moral responsibility, he told officers, "Tell Pamela she's not responsible for all of this." This, of course, implied the opposite, that the breakup of their relationship had left him so devastated that she had driven him to murder. Although Black claims that while he was seeing Pamela, he did not abuse any girls, he was forced to leave Grangemouth for just that. Black's mounting obsession with little girls and his fascination with their vaginas would not have disappeared during his relationship with Pamela, although he may have had less opportunity to act out his desires, and they resurfaced in 1966. This time, the victim was the 9-year-old granddaughter of his landlord and landlady. The abuse took the same form as it had previously, with Black looking at, touching, and putting his fingers inside the girl's vagina. She eventually told her parents, yet it was decided that the police would not be called. It was felt that the girl had been through enough and Black was ordered to leave the house. Gossip spreads quickly in small towns. Sacked for his job without reason, and his place in the community undermined, Black headed to Kinlochleven where he had been brought up. Again, he took a room with a couple who had a young daughter, and again, the inevitable happened. The 7-year-old was subjected to the same type of digital intrusion that was typical of Black's behavior. When the abuse came to light, Black was not so fortunate as he had been in Grangemouth, and the police were called to deal with the situation. In March 1967, Black was found guilty of 3 counts of indecent assault and sentenced to a year of Borstal training to be served at Polmount near Grangemouth. On his release, Black had tired of Scotland, where he was getting too well known and where his police record was expanding. It was time to go south, to the anonymity of London. Although he avoided any criminal convictions in the 1970s, his obsession with young girls was growing, fueled by his discovery of underage pornography. In the 1970s, Black discovered that magazines such as Teenage Sex and Lollytots were clandestinely available, particularly in places like Amsterdam, where the pornography laws are less stringent. When Black's room was eventually searched by police in the 1990s, they found over 100 underage pornography magazines and over 50 videotapes, with titles such as Lesbian Lolita. When Ray Wire asked Black what he thought the age of consent should be, Black replied approvingly that someone had once told him that his motto was, "When they're big enough, they're old enough." When he first arrived in London, Black lived in cheap bedsits and took casual work where he could find it. His favorite job was that of swimming pool attendant, where he was sometimes able to go underneath the pool and remove the lights to look at the little girls as they swam. At night, he used to break into the baths and swim lengths with a broom handle lodged up his anus. It wasn't long before Black became the subject of a complaint from a girl who claimed that he had touched her. The police were called, but luck was on Black's side, and despite his record, he was not charged with any criminal offense, although he lost his job. When he was not working, Black had developed a liking for darts and was a distinctly useful player. Most of his spare times was spent in pubs, drinking, although never heavily, playing in various darts teams, or doing part-time bar work. Although he enjoyed going to pubs, Black never made any good friends as he was a solitary man. Michael Collier, the former landlord of the Bearing Arms in Islington where Black played for the pub team, recalls that, "For all the years he drank in my pub, you would never have called him a mate. He always drank pints of lager shandy, but he never got involved in rounds. When he wasn't playing darts, he just stood by the fruit machine. He was a bit of a wind-up merchant and enjoyed irritating people, particularly women. He never talked about himself and he never spoke about his interests or joined in conversations." The former world darts champion, Eric Bristow, who knew Black from the amateur darts circuit in North London, similarly remembers him as a loner who never turned up with a girlfriend or anything. He just wasn't the type. He was a regular guy who would come into the pub and play darts. Black met Eddie and Kathy Rayson in a pub in Stamford Hill in 1972. They got chatting and Black told him how he needed a place to live. The Raysons' attic room was free, and although Eddie wasn't too keen initially, Kathy said that Black seemed like a big softie, so they decided to take him in. After Black's conviction in 1994, Eddie Rayson remembered Black as a perfect tenant. He always paid the rent on time and never caused us any problems. He used to eat meals with a couple and their children, who had nicknamed him Smelly Bob, and they occasionally went up to his room to listen to music or play cards, but other than that, they rarely saw him. Although Eddie Rayson says that he was a bit like a father to him, Black never talked to him about personal matters or his past. Eddie and Kathy's son, Paul, says of Black, "He was a bit odd, and as kids growing up, we called him names mainly because he smelled, but he was an ideal tenant. In fact, he was more than just a tenant, but not what you would call a friend. Not the sort of person you would ever be able to get close to, or would want to." The Raysons said that Black was a keen photographer, and they sometimes jokingly called him David Bailey. It later transpired that one of his favorite pastimes was to go to the seaside or a playground which was frequented by young children and video them playing or take snapshots of them. Photography not only serves as a source of images that can be chosen to excite, but it's also frequently used in a documentary sense to provide the killer with a chronicle of his own history. As such, of course, the killer becomes the hero of his own world, the maker of it, the director, the protagonist. In 1976, Black began to work for a firm called Poster Dispatch and Storage, PDS, as a driver. His job was to deliver posters to various depots around England and Scotland. It was ideal work for him. He was a bad timekeeper, so it suited him to keep basically to his own schedule. And as a loner, he found driving for hours by himself an agreeable way to earn a living. He worked for PDS for the next 10 years until his employers were forced to dismiss him as he was constantly getting involved in minor car accidents and costing the company a fortune in insurance payments. Luckily for Black, shortly after his dismissal, PDS was bought out by 2 employees who gave him back his job. He continued to get into scrapes, but he was a hard worker and was always glad to cover for his workmates, doing the longer runs which the other drivers disliked as they interfered with their family commitments. Black frequently did the London to Scotland run, often stopping in the Midlands on his way back to see the Rayson's son John and his new family. In the back of his van, he would keep various objects as masturbatory tools to be inserted up his anus while he fantasized about touching young girls. He later told police that he would get into the back of his van on night runs and dress himself in girls' clothing, particularly swimming costumes, while he was masturbating. He told Ray Wire that over the years, the recollection and images of the assault in which he had left the 7-year-old girl for dead kept returning. The assault would have been replayed and extended in Black's mind so often that when it finally drove him to his first murder, it seemed a perfectly natural progression to him. But the fantasy is never totally fulfilled. The deep anger and frustration never finally resolved. And tragically, the cycle of fantasy and murder repeats itself. there's always the desire to reenact the sequence in the quest for ultimate fulfillment. The FBI maintain that serial killers actually murder because of their thought processes, which constitute their motivation. Fantasy assumes a crucial role in sexual murders. These men murder because of the way they think. These cognitive acts gradually lead to the conscious planning and justification for murderous acts. But surely the citation of the primacy of fantasy in its enactment cannot answer a causal question. The further question of what causes the fantasy remains. Fantasies and thought processes must be caused by something, and we must assume that these origins are to be found in their personal histories. The reality of Robert Black as a child, his double loss of the mother, lack of the father, his feelings of rejection, of being unloved, the constant moving from place to place, and his abuse from the older adult meant to be in the role of career and protector, was a reality so devoid of either love or hope that fantasies involving domination and the perverse search for the lost mother-child are understandable. It was a hot afternoon on the penultimate day of July in 1982, and 11-year-old Susan Maxwell had asked her mother, Liz, if she could cycle to the tennis game which she was going to play with her friend Allison Rayburn. Liz was reluctant to let Susan cycle on her own as she was worried about the traffic, but after some consideration, she told her daughter that she could walk if she liked. Susan had never yet walked anywhere alone, but at some point, a child has to be allowed to start the process of independence. The Maxwells lived in a farmhouse outside Cornell in Tweed, a small village on the English side of the English-Scottish border. Susan's tennis game was across the Scottish border in Coldstream, about 2 miles from her home, and on a route where Susan would know most everybody she passed on the way. It was an area where people looked out for one another, particularly for the children. In the end, Susan didn't walk to her game, as one of the farm workers going into Coldstream offered her a lift, but she planned to walk back. When 4 o'clock came and it was time for Susan to be walking home, Liz decided to go and pick her up. Liz remembers, she wasn't expecting me, but I thought, it's a very hot afternoon. After she's been playing tennis for an hour, she'll be hot and sticky and too tired to walk back. So I put the wee ones in the back and we went over. On the way there, where Liz was expecting to encounter Susan on her way home, there was no sign of her. At the Lennell Tennis Club and on the return journey to the farm, Susan was still nowhere to be found. A phone call to Susan's friend Allison quickly established that she'd left Susan making her way home. I started to panic then, said Liz, and Fordyce, her husband, said to just phone the police straight away. The police were called and inquiries swiftly began. Many people had seen Susan that afternoon, both people who knew her and people who simply remembered a little girl dressed in yellow swinging a tennis racket. These sightings of Susan were numerous until a certain point just over the Tweed Bridge, yards across the border into England. She was seen as she crossed the bridge by several people at about 4:30, and then she was gone. Nobody had seen her abduction, but in the space of a moment, she had vanished. The days after Susan's presumed abduction were spent meticulously combing the countryside and looking for clues to her disappearance. After the Northumbria police appealed for volunteers, nearly 2/3 of the population of Cornell joined in the search. Fordyce himself went out every day with the search parties. As the Maxwells were journalists themselves, they spoke to the press constantly in the belief that it could only be beneficial to keep Susan in the public eye. It was after one such media event that the news which they had been dreading finally arrived, 2 weeks after Susan's disappearance. On Friday, the 13th of August, Liz and Fordyce had been on Radio 2 talking of Susan's abduction and appealing to the public for information. When they returned, the police were waiting for them. Liz recalls, he, the officer, said they found a little girl, and I remember he wouldn't say the word dead. He just said, this little girl is not alive. And that was when the sort of coldness spread right through me. A man named Arthur Meadows had found Susan's body. It was in a ditch next to a lay-by on the A518 road at Loxley, just outside of Atoxeter in the Midlands, 250 miles from where Susan had been abducted. When Liz and Fordyce asked if they could see their daughter's body, the officer, as tactfully as he could, replied that the weather had been very warm. The body had decomposed beyond recognition after 2 weeks in the hot summer sun, meaning that Susan was only able to be identified by her dental records. The pathologist was not even able to determine how she had died. The only clue was that Susan's pants had been removed. Her shorts were then replaced, her pants folded beneath her head. This confirmed suspicions that the motive for the attack was sexual, though what form this took has never been established. As Susan's body was found in Staffordshire, it was the job of the Staffordshire police to lead the murder hunt, although they worked closely with the Northumbria force. Witnesses of Susan's final walk were re-questioned, and people who had been in the area where Susan's body had been found were located and interviewed. Photographs of the girl were widely distributed, and a reconstruction staged to prompt flagging memories. Hotels and caravan sites were visited to elicit information on visitors to the area at the time of the murder, who were subsequently questioned. Drivers from transport firms between Scotland and Staffordshire were interviewed. One of the most promising leads came from Mark Ball, a psychiatric nurse, who claimed to have seen a little girl matching Susan's description hitting out at a maroon Triumph 2000 with a tennis racket on the day Susan was abducted. His evidence was finally dismissed by the police, although not until some 19,000 drivers of maroon Triumphs had been questioned. After almost a year, the inquiry began to draw to a close. The manual database now comprised of about 500,000 handwritten index cards. Yet despite all the data, the investigation had reached a dead end, and like the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry, the investigation was also in imminent danger of swamping the police by generating such an immense amount of uncomputerized information. Tragically, as is so often the case, it took another murder to provide the police with new information to get the investigation underway once more. A year later, on the 8th of July 1983, in the seaside resort of Portobello on the outskirts of Edinburgh, 5-year-old Carolyn Hogg had been having a nice day. That afternoon, she had been to a friend's party, and after returning home for dinner, she took her grandmother to the bus stop with her mother, Annette. They returned just before 7 o'clock that evening, and Carolyn, who was still lively, begged her mother to let her go down the road for a few minutes' play before bedtime. It was quite usual for Carolyn to go to the playground, which was just a short walk from their house, and Annette said she could go for 5 minutes. Like Coldstream, Portobello is a small community where the residents all know each other. Besides, Carolyn had always been told never to talk to strangers and was forbidden to go past the park to the promenade or the permanent fairground, Fun City. Fun City. At 7:15, Annette, who had told Carolyn to be just 5 minutes, sent her son Stuart to look for his sister. When he came back, unable to find her, Annette herself went out, and soon the whole family were looking for Carolyn. The police were called at just before 8 o'clock. Many people had seen the little girl that night, and some of the sightings were of Carolyn with her abductor. There were reports of Carolyn holding hands with a scruffy man. This man was seen looking at the girl in the playground, and then at Fun City, the place forbidden to her, where he paid for her to go on the children's roundabout. They were last seen walking out of the back entrance of Fun City, still holding hands. As they had in the previous summer, the police quickly set up search parties. Carolyn was abducted on Friday. By Sunday, the police had more than 600 volunteers who went over every inch of the local area for any sign of her. A week later, this number had risen to some 2,000 people. It was the largest search ever carried out in Scotland, but they would find nothing, as Carolyn, like Susan, had quickly been transported many miles south. Unlike the Maxwells, Annette and John Hogg spoke only once to the media. In a press conference where John begged to her abductor, "Just bring her back. Please, let her come home." Annette, crying, told the public, "We really miss her. I really miss her." There seemed to be no leads, as Superintendent Ronald Stalker candidly told the press. "I'm afraid that all we have to say at this stage is that we've turned up nothing at all." Carolyn's body was found on the 18th of July in a lay-by at Tweecross in Leicestershire, near to the A444, the road that goes from Northampton to Coventry. Her body had been left some 300 miles from where she had been taken, just as Susan's had been. Yet their bodies were found within just 24 miles of each other. It had been 10 days since Carolyn had disappeared, and again the body was so decomposed from the hot weather that the cause of death was a mystery. She was identified by her hairband and locket. Even more clearly so this time, the motive was sexual. Carolyn's body was completely naked. Because of the obvious similarities in the murders of Susan and Carolyn, it was decided by the chief constables of the four forces now involved: Northumbria, where Susan was abducted; Staffordshire, where Susan was found; Edinburgh, where Carolyn was abducted; and Leicestershire, where Carolyn was found, that the investigations into the murders should be made into a joint inquiry. In July, the Deputy Chief Constable of the Northumbria Police, Hector Clark, was put in charge. From the outset, Clark had been told that part of his objective in this inquiry was to see how computers could be used to aid in such an investigation. It was the first opportunity since the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry for the police to see how the early use of computers in a serial murder investigation could be beneficial. As the amount of data from the Susan Maxwell investigation alone was immense, Clark thought that the joint inquiry would be most efficient if this was computerized, which would involve transcribing all the manual files into a computer database. The Carolyn Hogg inquiry would be fed into the same database as it progressed. The idea was right, yet it was not given the go-ahead, as it was felt that too much time would be spent in back-converting the files. Instead, a computer program was written for the Carolyn Hogg inquiry alone, and the Susan Maxwell investigation was to remain manual. In Portobello, witnesses on the promenade and at Fun City were interviewed, and house-to-house inquiries were made. In Leicestershire, officers sat for weeks by the A444, taking down the registration numbers of cars that passed. LIOs, local intelligence officers, from every force in the entire country were asked to draw up lists of possible suspects. The houses of men who were established to have been on the promenade that night for immoral purposes were searched. Holidaymakers from as far as Australia were asked to send in rolls of camera or cinefilm they had taken in Portobello. A reconstruction of Carolyn's last journey was staged. Parking tickets issued in Edinburgh were examined, and an artist's impression was drawn up of the scruffy man, which prompted more than 600 names to be put forward by the public. Perhaps the most hopeful lead was from a Mr. and Mrs. Flynn, who saw a blue Ford Cortina with a man and a scared-looking young girl in it. 20,000 drivers of blue Cortinas were interviewed. Unfortunately, as with the maroon Triumph, the lead turned out to be a red herring. At the beginning of the summer of 1984, the police were in a similar situation to that of the previous summer. They had been diligent. They had collated a huge amount of information, yet they had no real leads, no suspects. There was now a 3-year gap until the next murder in the series of child killings that was already being dubbed by the press as the most horrific since the Moors murders. On the 26th of March, 1986, 10-year-old Sarah Harper was the third little girl to be taken. Sarah lived in Morley, Leeds, which was further south than the other two girls, but still in the north of England. At 8 o'clock that evening, just as Coronation Street was ending, Sarah's mother Jackie asked if one of her children would go to the corner shop to buy a loaf of bread. Sarah volunteered to go, taking £1 from her mother and picking up 2 empty lemonade bottles to get the deposit on them. Sarah left her home in Brunswick Place to go to the K&M stores on Peel Street, just over 100 yards from her house. At K&M, the proprietor, Mrs. Champaneri, clearly remembers Sarah coming in. The girl returned the lemonade bottles and bought a loaf of white bread and 2 packets of crisps. She left the shop at 8:05, and shortly afterwards, 2 girls who knew her saw Sarah walking home toward the Snicket, an alley used by locals as a shortcut. Then, like Susan and Carolyn, she disappeared. At about 8:15, Jackie started to worry, as the journey should have only taken Sarah 5 minutes. Although Jackie thought that Sarah was probably just dawdling or eating crisps in the alley, she sent Sarah's sister, Claire, out to look for her. When Claire came back with no news of her sister, the family went out in the car to search for her. At 9 o'clock, the police were called, and once again, searches and inquiries were swiftly set into motion. Once again, they proved fruitless. On the 19th of April, David Moult remembers how he was walking his dog by the River Trent in Nottingham when he spotted something floating in the water. I thought it was a piece of sacking. Then the current turned it round and I realized it was a body. Using a stick, Moult managed to drag the body over to the side of the riverbank. He then called the police. It was later determined that Sarah Harper had been put in the river at around junction 24 of the M1 when she was still alive. The pathologist who examined her body described the injuries, which had been inflicted pre-mortem, as terrible. As Ray Wire later described it, Sarah's assailant had violently explored both her vagina and her anus. Jackie Harper, like Liz Maxwell, vividly remembers being told of the discovery of her daughter's body. All the officer could say was, "Would you like to make a cup of tea?" And all I kept saying was, "Will you tell me what you have to tell me?" I knew why they were there. It was obvious. But he wouldn't tell me. He just kept going on about this bloody tea. All I wanted him to say was, "Yes, we found her." It fell to Terry Harper, Sarah's father, Jackie's ex-husband, to identify his daughter's body. "It was worse than I ever dreamed of," he said. Although Hector Clark was careful to keep an open mind, he believed at the time that Sarah's abduction and murder was not connected to those of Susan and Caroline. The differences, he said, outweighed the similarities. Susan and Caroline were both abducted on hot July days in colorful summer clothes. Sarah was abducted on a cold, dark, rainy night in March, her small body covered with an anorak. Both Coldstream and Portobello are on or near main roads, commonly used routes through which many travelers pass. Morley is not the sort of place you go without a reason. This initially led Clark to believe that Sarah's abduction was committed by a local man who knew the area well. In retrospect, however, the similarities, although perhaps fewer in number, were certainly more telling. All the victims were young girls who had been skillfully abducted from public places for a sexual purpose. They were all driven south and murdered, their bodies dumped in the Midlands within 26 miles of each other. Sarah may have been subjected to a more vicious attack than the other two girls, although the evidence is inconclusive. But if anything, this pointed to, and not away from, the same offender being responsible. In serial murders, the attacks frequently get more violent as they go along. This is true of Peter Sutcliffe, for instance. As the killer gains confidence and needs more and more acts of violation and mutilation to keep him aroused. Therefore, it would not be surprising if the murder of Sarah Harper was more extreme in its sexual brutality than the murders of Susan Maxwell and Carolyn Hogg. Initially, the investigation into Sarah Harper's murder was conducted as a separate inquiry, led by Detective Superintendent John Stainthorpe of the West Yorkshire Police. Yet close links were maintained to the joint Maxwell-Hogg inquiry in order to keep all avenues of approach open. The same painstaking inquiries were made in the case of Sarah Harper as had been with Susan and Carolyn. House-to-house inquiries were conducted. People who had seen a white van parked by and near Sarah's house were interviewed, and an artist's impression of a strange man who was seen on the street and in K&M stores was circulated. LIOs were again asked to draw up lists of men who had committed similar offenses, and they were all interviewed. Yet this time, the police had an advantage, as by now the Home Office large major enquiry system had been established. Homes had been donated to the West Yorkshire Police after the Yorkshire Ripper fiasco, and it was utilized from the first day of the Sarah Harper investigation. The system was designed to efficiently log, process, collate, and compare information at the press of a switch. Once all the data from the investigation had been fed into homes, names of possible suspects or vehicle registration numbers, for instance, could be fed into the system, which would instantly tell the user whether the name or vehicle had come up previously in the investigation. Despite this new technological efficiency, however, the police were getting no further in their investigation. Ultimately, no matter how sophisticated Holmes was, if the name of the offender was not stored anywhere in its memory, it was useless. The police were relying on their killer's name being in the system. If it was, then the right questions to Holmes would then unearth them. Failing this, the computer was reduced to an efficient storage container. It would not identify a murderer. After 8 months of the Sarah Harper inquiry had passed, Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary decided that all 3 cases should be linked and that one database ought to be established. This was a gargantuan task. The Maxwell investigation had never been computerized at all. The Hogg investigation had been, as had the Harper, yet the programs were incompatible. All 3 complete investigations had to be inputted, with the necessary conversions, into one database. The process took 3 years. In July of 1990, the task was finally complete. It transpired, however, that there was no opportunity to test the effectiveness of a single database. Once again, as in previous serial murder investigations, luck was to prove a key factor in apprehension. As Clark said, once we had exhausted all our lines of inquiry, the best chance of catching the man responsible was if he struck again. Clark added, my biggest hope, however, was that he'd be caught before he went too far and killed a girl. As with Peter Sutcliffe, Black's apprehension came about during the course of an abduction, which would certainly have turned into another murder. It was the 14th of July, 1990, a sunny day in the village of Stowe in the Scottish borders, and 6-year-old Mandy Wilson was walking to her friend's house to play. As she walked down the road, one of her neighbors, David Herx, watched her approach a van with its passenger door open. Herx later told the police in a statement that as he bent down to look at his mower blades, all I could see were her little feet standing next to the man's. Suddenly they vanished, and I saw him making movements as if he were trying to stuff something under the dashboard. He got into the van, reversed up the driveway the child had just come from, and sped off toward Edinburgh. David Herx had the presence of mind to take the van's registration number and then quickly rang the police. Police cars were promptly on the scene, and the van's description was radioed to officers in the area. Herx remembers what happened next. I was standing near the spot where the child had been abducted, briefing the police and the girl's distraught father about what had happened. Suddenly, I saw the van again and shouted, "That's him!" The officer dashed into the road and the van swerved to avoid him before coming to a halt. While officers handcuffed the man, who identified himself as Robert Black, Mandy's father, Mr. Wilson, recalls, "I shouted at Black, 'That's my daughter, what have you done to her, you bastard?' But his reaction was nil. He had no expression. I could have got my hands round his throat there and then, but my concern was for my daughter, not him. Where was she? Was she alive or, God forbid, dead? I went straight for a pile of rags just behind the seat and felt a little body inside the sleeping bag. I can't tell you how I felt as I unwrapped her from the bag and saw her little face bright red from the heat and lack of air. She was so terrified as I untied her and took the tape from her mouth that she didn't utter a word. Before Black had tied Mandy's hands behind her back, covered her mouth with elastoplast, and shoved her into a sleeping bag, he had non-consensual sex with her. He later told Ray Wire that, "I pulled her pants to one side and I had a look. I thought I'd just sort of stroked her vagina, but there was bruising on the inside. I don't know how." He then told Wire what he would have done if he had not been caught. "When I'd done the delivery in Galashiels down the road, I would have had non-consensual sex with Mandy. I would have probably stripped her from the waist down, but I would have untied her and probably took the plaster off her mouth. And if she called out when I was assaulting her, then I might have put the gag back on." More specifically, Wire quotes Dr. Baird, psychologist for the Crown, who told Black that he would have put things into her vagina to see how big she was. He would have put his fingers in and also his penis. When asked about other objects, he agreed he might have put other objects into her vagina. And when asked for an example, he saw a pen with which I was writing. When Wire asked Black how he could do such a devastating thing to a child while simultaneously claiming, as he had done previously, that he loved children, Black admitted that, "I wasn't thinking about her at all. Like, what she must be feeling. If she had died, it would have been a pure accident." This extraordinary dissociation, which transforms the little girl into a simple object, is frequently to be found in the cases of other serial killers. But in Black's case, it seems to preclude the sadism that takes pleasure in the victim's sufferings. The child became a plaything, to be experimented with, poked, probed, and eventually disposed of. It seems to have been a matter of indifference to Black whether she objected to the process or not. On the way to Selkirk Police Station, Black told officers that the abduction was a rush of blood and added, "I've always liked little girls since I was a kid." He said that he had just wanted to keep her until he had done his next delivery, and then he would have spent some time with her, maybe in Blackpool. Then he would have let her go. Robert Black's case came to trial the next month, on the 10th of August, 1990. As the evidence in this particular case was overwhelming, Black had little choice but to plead guilty. In light of the plea, the job of the prosecution was simply to give the facts of the case, which the Lord Advocate, Lord Fraser, did, stressing that medical opinion said that Mandy would probably have been dead within the hour if she had been kept bound and gagged in the sleeping bag. Dr. Baird's report for the Crown said that Black was, and would remain, a danger to children. The task of the defense was to speak in mitigation. To this end, Herbert Kerrigan said that Black had admitted to liking little girls, but had never before acted upon his desires. The abduction had been a one-off, and Black merely wanted to spend some time with Mandy. He did not intend to injure her, certainly not to kill her. Furthermore, Black had accepted that he was a threat to children and, said Kerrigan, wishes to engage in some sort of program to get assistance. Dismissing the arguments of the defense, the Lord Justice Clerk, Lord Ross, described Mandy's abduction as being carried out with chilling, cold calculation. This was, he said, no rush of blood as you have claimed. This was a very serious case, a horrific, appalling case. Lord Ross sentenced Black to life imprisonment and told him that his release would not be considered until such time as it's safe to do so. Of course, the abduction of Mandy Smith made Black a prime suspect for Hector Clark, as the MO was strikingly similar to that of the cases of Susan, Carolyn, and Sarah. When Clark first saw Black following his arrest in July 1990, he remembers, "Slowly he looked up at me and my gut feeling was that this was my man. I'd always thought that when I saw him, I would know him, and every instinct told me this was the guy. I knew by his body smell and his disheveled appearance. Except that he was bald, he was just as I expected. But gut feeling and instinct are not good enough. In spending so much time analyzing such crimes, the police inevitably start to feel that they know the offenders in certain ways. They think they know what they'll look like and how they'll behave." George Oldfield, heading the Yorkshire Ripper Inquiry, similarly said on several occasions that if he were in a room full of potential suspects, he would instantly know his man. But as the Ripper investigation showed us, this is a dangerous assumption. Peter Sutcliffe was interviewed 9 times during the course of the 5-year investigation, but nobody recognized him. In the hope of eliciting some incriminating evidence, the police decided to interview Black. As he was already serving a life sentence, they thought that he might be willing to talk about any other crimes he had committed. Interviewed in Scotland, Black talked candidly to officers about the offenses for which he had previously been convicted for the best part of 6 hours. He was frank about a variety of topics, including his one proper relationship with a woman, his attraction to little girls, the abuse he had endured as a child, his fantasy life, and his masturbatory practices. Eventually, however, when the officers asked Black about his work with Poster Dispatch and Storage and his whereabouts on the day of Carolyn Hogg's abduction, he fell silent. When it came to the abductions and murders of the 3 little girls, Black would simply not talk to the police. It was apparent that the police would have to find their evidence the hard way, through old-fashioned, painstaking detective work. They were going to have to look at Black's life over the past 8 years. In most cases, the tracing of a person's daily movements over the past decade would prove an impossible task. But in this case, the police were fortuitous due to the nature of Black's work. From a careful examination of work records, wage books, and receipts from fuel credit cards, the police were able to begin tracing Black's life. Susan Maxwell's abduction had taken place in Coldstream on the 30th of July, 1982. It was the task of the police to establish where Black was at every stage during that day. The first step in the process was to see whether PDS had records of journeys carried out by drivers dating that far back. The police were initially dismayed to find the potentially vital company records had been destroyed just months beforehand, as was company policy after a certain length of time had elapsed. Yet new hope arose when it was established that the wage books from that time were still available. As different runs command different wages, it was established, from the amount of money that Black received in his pay, that he must have done the London-Scotland run sometime between the 29th of July and the 4th of August. The time still needed narrowing down, however. The police next looked at petrol receipts from the company's fuel credit cards that all drivers carried, and it was established that Black had been in the Borders area on the 30th of July. He'd filled up his white Fiat van just south of Coldstream before the time that Susan was snatched, and just north of Coldstream after the time of her abduction. The quickest route between the 2 garages was the A687, directly through Coldstream. Black had previously told his workmates that when returning from a Scottish run, he preferred not to take the most direct route, which was the M6 to the M1, but to get to the M1 via the A50 through the Midlands. Susan's body was found by the A518 in Staffordshire, not far from the junction for the A50. The case against Black for the murder of Carolyn Hogg was built in a similarly meticulous fashion. On the 8th of July 1982, the day of Carolyn's abduction, it was established that Black had delivered posters to Mills and Allen in Pearshill, just over a mile north of Portobello. Petrol receipts showed that he had filled up at a petrol station in Belford, Northumberland on this day, and that the most obvious route from Belford to his delivery point in Pearshill was through Portobello. The post-mortem had found that Carolyn's body had been kept by her killer for 4 days after her abduction. Dead or alive, they could not determine, making the 12th the first day on which her body could have been disposed. On this day, Black had delivered posters to Bedworth, just over 10 miles from where Carolyn's body was found. The circumstantial evidence for the case of Sarah Harper was equally strong. On the 26th of March, the day of her abduction, Black had delivered posters to a depot just 150 yards from the place that Sarah was last seen. Petrol receipts from the next day put Black as driving directly past the spot on the A453 to Nottingham, where Sarah's body had been deposited. In addition to the growing mountain of circumstantial evidence, another incident came to Clark's notice. On the 28th of April 1988, 15-year-old Teresa Thornhill had been to the park with some friends. Teresa walked part of the way home with one of those friends, Andrew Beeson. Just after she and Andrew had gone their separate ways, Teresa noticed that a blue van had stopped just ahead of her on the opposite side of the road. The driver had got out and was looking under the bonnet. As she approached, the man shouted to her, "Can you mend engines?" Uneasily, she replied that she could not and walked on. The next thing she knew, the man had grabbed her from behind, picked her up, and was carrying her across to his van. She said later, "I'll never forget his hairy arms, sweaty hands, and smelly t-shirt. He came over to me and got me in an all-encompassing bear hug which I could not get out of because he was very strong. I tried to struggle free and began shouting for my mom. I was looking around for something to hit him with, but there was nothing there. Then I grabbed him between the legs." She also knocked his glasses to the ground, screaming all the while. Teresa's friend Andrew heard her screams and ran towards the van shouting, "Get off her, you fat fucking bastard." Teresa's struggle and Andrew's timely arrival meant that her attacker had little choice but to drop his victim and make his getaway. Unfortunately, at the time there was nothing to obviously link Teresa's attack to the abductions and murders of Susan, Carolyn, and Sarah. Most importantly, these girls were aged between 5 and 11, whereas Teresa was 15, nearly a woman. Teresa looked far younger than her years, however. She was under 5 feet tall, with a girlish figure, and wore no makeup. She did not look like a teenager. If this had been taken into account at the time, the abductions would have seemed remarkably similar. If this case could be shown to be linked to the murders, then it was an important breakthrough, as Teresa's description of her attacker and his van matched Black exactly. By the end of 1990, the police had gathered a mass of circumstantial evidence against Black, but unfortunately, they had no forensic evidence and no confession. They decided to re-interview Black more vigorously, but for 3 days, he refused to answer any of their questions, as was his right. The police had no real choice but to proceed with what they had. In May of 1991, the police submitted their report to the Crown Prosecution Service, who would decide whether to go ahead with a prosecution. In April 1992, Black was served with 10 summonses. Yet it would be another 2 years before the case was tried. Aside from the fact that there were 22 tons of evidence that had to be made available for the defense to examine, there were many difficult legal problems to sort out in the preliminary hearings. Firstly, there were jurisdictional questions to clear up, given that the crimes had been committed across 2 countries with different legal procedures. Additionally, the prosecution's case relied on being allowed to present the murders as a series, while the defense applied for severance of the charges. Finally, the abduction of Mandy Wilson was an issue under hot debate. The prosecution needed to present it as evidence of the defendant's unique MO, whereas the defense wanted it precluded from proceedings. The submission of a past offense as evidence of the commission of a present offense is called similar fact evidence and is notoriously controversial. It's usually only permitted when the past offense is strikingly similar to the present. In Black's case, it was allowed. The pretrial rulings were all made in the prosecution's favor, and at last the case was ready to come to trial. As most of his crimes had been carried out in England, it had been decided that this was where Black would be tried. Mr. John Milford, leading for the Crown, began his opening speech at 2 o'clock on the afternoon of Wednesday the 13th of April, 1994, in the Moot Hall in Newcastle. Ultimately, he aimed to prove that the murders of Susan Maxwell, Carolyn Hogg, and Sarah Harper, and the abduction of Teresa Thornhill were all part of a series committed by the same person, and that this person had to be Black. There was no forensic evidence nor any admissions of guilt from the defendant himself, so the case was to be based upon evidence which, while admittedly circumstantial, was still very strong. Black had been in all the abduction points and the places where the bodies had been dumped at the pertinent times. Descriptions given by witnesses matched Black's appearance at those times. On the days in question, Black was driving the types of vans spotted at the scenes, and he had already admitted to an abduction in 1990, which bore exactly the same unusual MO as the offenses for which he was now being charged. Milford highlighted to the jury the similarities between the murders in order to prove that they were all committed by the same man, which was his first essential point. All the victims were young girls. All were bare-legged, wearing white ankle socks. All were taken from a public place. Susan and Carolyn were both abducted on hot July days. All were abducted in a vehicle of some sort. Susan and Sarah were both abducted in transit-type vans. After abduction, all the victims were taken some miles south. All the bodies showed signs of a sexual motive for the attack. Each victim was obviously taken for sexual gratification. Susan Maxwell's pants were removed, Carolyn Hogg was naked, and Sarah Harper was found to have suffered injury. None suffered any gross bruising or broken bones. Both Susan and Sarah had been unclothed and then reclothed. All three victims had their shoes removed. No real attempt was made to hide the bodies. All the bodies had been dumped in what became known to the police as the Midlands Triangle, a 26-mile area encompassing parts of Nottinghamshire, Staffordshire, and Leicestershire. These murders, said Milford, are so unusual, the points of similarity so numerous and peculiar, that it's submitted to you that you can safely conclude that they were all the work of one man. And this one man, as overwhelming evidence would prove, was Robert Black. The Crown alleges that Robert Black kidnapped each of his victims for sexual gratification, that he transported them far from the point of abduction, and murdered them. Having outlined the similarities of the murders, Milford moved on to the charge of the abduction of Teresa Thornhill in Nottingham in 1988. This case clearly had the same features as the previous abductions. Teresa was a girl who looked younger than her 15 years, who was snatched off a busy street in the north of England by a scruffy-looking man driving a van. After detailing the similarities, Milford told the court that that very day, Black was delivering posters to a firm in Nottingham in his blue transit van, and the description that Teresa gave to the police of her attacker matched photographs of Black at the time. When police searched Black's room after his arrest, they found a paper from 1988 with a report in it about the attempted abduction. Teresa also told police that her attacker smelt strongly. The Rayson children had nicknamed their lodger Smelly Bob, and Eric Mould, Black's former boss at PDS, told the court that his workers used to complain that Black was unclean and had bad body odor. Following Justice McPherson's pretrial ruling, the court were next told of Black's arrest for the abduction and assault of Mandy Wilson in Stowe in July of 1990. Milford said that Black had admitted to this abduction and assault, and that it had all the hallmarks of the three murders and the abduction that he now stood trial for. In fact, the crimes were virtually carbon copies. At Stowe, he was repeating almost exactly what had happened at Coldstream. Milford continued, the little girl in Stowe was wearing shorts when she was taken, was bare-legged, and was wearing white socks. She was to be transported many miles south. Again, it was the end of the week, it was July, and it was hot. Stowe and Coldstream are similar villages only 25 miles apart. Even more remarkably, like Susan Maxwell, the little girl was wearing yellow shorts. Black had admitted to the abduction of Mandy Wilson. This abduction was a carbon copy of that of Susan Maxwell. The abduction of Teresa Thornhill and the abductions and murders of Carolyn and Sarah were carbon copies of Susan's abduction and murder. Ergo, Black committed the 3 murders. The prosecution had made a good start. It had detailed striking comparisons which linked the murders of Susan, Carolyn, and Sarah and the abduction of Teresa as a series. It had also shown the similarities between these offenses and the one to which Black had already admitted. It was an important beginning, but by itself was not enough. They had established a series, but now they had to establish that Black was the perpetrator. The prosecution's next job was to go through the police inquiry for the court, telling them exactly how the police had gathered the evidence which put Black at all the abduction and dumping areas at the salient times. At the end of this evidence, which lasted for some days, Milford sardonically concluded that either Black was the killer or a similarly perverted shadow of Black was following him around the country, a shadow who also had convictions for non-consensual sex with children and a penchant for underage pornography. The murders of Susan, Carolyn, and Sarah, and the abduction of Teresa were all committed by one man, and Robert Black had been present at all the pertinent sites at these times. Deputy Chief Constable Hector Clark was saved for last. Clark described the mammoth investigation as the largest crime inquiry ever held in Britain. The computer held details of 187,186 people, 220,470 vehicles, and interviews with 59,483 people. When Milford asked Clark how unusual it was for 3 children to have been abducted, murdered, and then dumped a relatively long distance away, Clark replied that in his 39-year career as a policeman, "I have no knowledge of any other cases with these features." The case for the prosecution was closed. There had been much speculation as to how Ronald Thwaites would conduct the case for the defense. Certainly, the prosecution had no forensic evidence, nor did it have any help from the defendant himself. But equally, Black had not offered any alibis which the defense could use, nor did it have any other alternative suspects. Thwaites also had a self-admitted child abductor and abuser to defend. The only realistic path to take was to acknowledge Black's previous known offenses and admit to the court that yes, this was a wicked and foul pervert, but argue that this did not necessarily make him a murderer. Thwaites said that Black had become a murderer for all seasons, a scapegoat for the desperate police who, after an 8-year investigation, had got no further than from where they'd started. This series of cases, said Thwaites, reeks of failure, disappointment, and frustration. When Black was arrested for the abduction in Stowe, officers set to work to dissect the whole of his life, with total disregard for anything that didn't fit into their picture of events. Thwaites told the jury of Black's previous convictions in Scotland for lewd and libidinous behavior and spoke of the pedo videos found in Black's room. Of the abduction of Mandy Wilson, he said that the judge saw it fit to give him a life sentence. No one can be surprised by that, and everyone must applaud it. Black's lifelong interest in children is further confirmed by the haul of pornography in his home. It's revolting and sickening to look at. But, he said, however wicked and foul Black is, and I'm not here to persuade you to like him or find any merit in him at all, it's not unreasonable to suppose that there might be some evidence to adorn the prosecution's case other than theory. This case has been developed before you using one incident of abduction, which he admitted, as a substitute for evidence in all these other cases. There's no direct evidence against Black. By evidence, of course, he meant that of a forensic variety, as there was plenty of other evidence to link Black to the murders. Although it was the prosecution who had called James Fraser of the Lothian and Borders Police Forensics Laboratory, his testimony benefited the defense. Fraser testified that he and 4 to 6 other scientists had spent 6 months working solely on this case, examining over 300 items belonging to Black, almost all his worldly goods. Then Thwaites asked him, cross-examining, "Have you been able to make a scientific link between this man, Black, and any of these murders?" Fraser replied, "No." The prosecution did, however, regain some credibility by asking Fraser if he would expect, after a decade, to find any significant forensic evidence, to which Fraser replied that he would not. Thwaites alleged that as both the police and the prosecution were so certain that Black was their man, they refused to look elsewhere. The Crown had tried to match together a new suit made from oddments, but it's full of holes, whereas the original suit has been left until discovered by my team. Black himself, said his defense, would not be testifying on his own behalf, as nobody could be expected to remember routine details of their lives going back over 10 years. But the truth was that the girl's killer or killers were still out there. In an attempt to convince the jury of this, the defense called Thomas Ball as their star witness, who testified that on the day of Susan's abduction, he saw a young girl hitting a maroon Triumph with a tennis racket. She was making quite a lot of noise, he recalled. It seemed to be a child throwing a fit of temper. He said that there were 2 or 3 people inside the car. The driver was a teenager with a wispy beard. When later shown a photograph of Susan by police, he said he was certain it was the child he had seen. Other defense witnesses included Sharon Binney, who told the court how she and her husband had seen a dark red saloon car like a Triumph 2000 parked in the same place as Thomas Ball described. Joan Jones and her husband, who had also seen a dark-colored car in a lay-by, and Alan Day and Peter Armstrong, who had similarly seen red saloon cars. Michelle Robertson, who was a young girl at the time of the murders, testified about seeing a scruffy man in a blue Ford Escort. Kevin Cathedral and Ian Collins claimed to have seen red Fords. This evidence did not further the case for the defense. However, as none of the people associated with these cars were doing anything remotely suspicious, they were simply in the vicinity of the abductions when they occurred. Ultimately, the question for the jury to decide, said Thwaites, is whether it may be proved he graduated from abuser to murderer. There's nothing automatic about that. The prosecution, he said dramatically, has conducted their case here from beginning to end without letting you into an important secret. The secret is that there is no evidence against Black. On Tuesday, the 17th of May, Mr. Justice McPherson sent the jury away to begin their deliberations. It was not, however, until the morning of the 3rd day, the 19th, that the jury finally agreed upon a verdict. When they found Black guilty on all counts, a sigh of relief went around the courtroom. Mr. Justice McPherson sentenced him to life for each of the charges, adding that for the murders, I propose to make a public recommendation that the minimum term will be 35 years on each of these convictions. As Black was taken down, he turned to the 23 officers who were there to hear the verdict and said, "Well done, boys." At a cost of some £1 million to the taxpayer, the trial was over, and Black would not be eligible for parole until he was at least 82 in 2029. To this day, Black has never admitted his guilt to the police. But in his last talk with Ray Wire, when Wire asked why Black had never denied the charges to him, Black replied that he hadn't done so because he couldn't. Once Black had been convicted, the recriminations began. Everybody wanted to know why it had taken 8 years for Black to be apprehended, 3 years longer than it had taken to catch Peter Sutcliffe. Amazing, one might think, considering Black's past. And unlike in the hunt for Sutcliffe, computers in general, and homes in particular, were used to trace Black. Partly, of course, the problem was that the murder investigations were not initially stored on one database, which meant that information between cases could not be adequately cross-referenced. When all 3 cases were eventually conjoined on one database, by this time, Black had already emerged as a suspect. Thus, the effectiveness of the new system could not be tested. However, although one database would have been invaluable in data storage and comparison between the investigations, it probably would not have caught Black. Holmes might well have played a vital part in catching Sutcliffe, as one of the major downfalls of that investigation was the poor cross-referencing, meant that when questioning Sutcliffe, officers simply didn't realize that he'd been interviewed several times before. If they'd realized this, there's little doubt that Sutcliffe would have emerged as a strong suspect. But the police had never interviewed Black in connection with the murders. He was simply not in the system as Sutcliffe was. Black was not in Holmes for the Harper inquiry, nor had his name cropped up in the Maxwell or Hogg inquiries. The single database would not have changed this. The question is really why Black was not identified as a suspect at any stage. After Black's trial, criticism was directed at Hector Clark from the media, and more distressingly, from other officers on the inquiry, particularly Detective Superintendent John Stainthorpe, who had headed the Sarah Harper investigation. Stainthorpe's criticism was that Clark had defined his parameters too narrowly when looking at men with records for sexual offenses as potential suspects. Clark had confined his search to men who had been convicted of serious sexual offenses, the attempted or actual abduction, non-consensual sex, or murder of a child under 16. Black, however, had been convicted of lewd and libidinous behavior, a charge which did not match the severity of the offense, with a 7-year-old girl in Scotland in 1967. Stainthorpe said that if Clark had included all sexual offenses, Black would have been a first-class suspect straight away, or at the very least would have been in the system. Black should have been arrested years ago, with his history and convictions. Clark was quick to defend himself to the press and public. "We just couldn't check on everybody," he said. "It would have overloaded the system to an unmanageable extent." He argued that criteria based on the most likely suspects had to be utilized. And given that the charges being investigated were for murder, looking at those offenders with convictions for more serious offenses seemed the most sensible way to proceed. However, when we look at research done into the backgrounds of serial killers, we see that if they have any past convictions, they're hardly ever serious and usually not sexual. John Christie, Ian Brady, Colin Ireland, and Fred West had previous convictions for offenses such as theft, fraud, and breaking and entering. Peter Sutcliffe, Dennis Nilsson, Myra Hindley, and Rose West had no criminal records at all before their convictions for murder. But Black was not just, or primarily, a serial killer. He was also a pedo, and unlike serial killers, pedos often do have past convictions for sexual offenses. These offenses, however, may often be relatively minor. Thus, if the investigation was to be centered around the creation of suspects based on previous form, Stainthorpe was right to say that even minor sexual offenses needed to be included. But of course, this was not a viable way to conduct the inquiry. In this sense, at least, Clark was right. The creation of a database with all sexual offenses committed in the past 20 years on it, and the subsequent investigation of the offender, was not a task the inquiry could manage. Just as the case of Peter Sutcliffe highlighted the need for a computer system such as Holmes to replace the old manual system of data collation, the Black inquiry made apparent the need for a constantly updated national database of all sex offenders and killers. They needed a system such as the FBI's VICAP, which can search its memory of sex offenders and their MOs to match the case under investigation. As John Stainthorpe said, had Black been on a computerized criminal intelligence system, his name would have popped up like a cork out of a bottle. And it probably would have, provided that the types of offense initially fed into the computer were comprehensive and went far enough back in time. In a case such as Sutcliffe's, where the killer has committed no past sexual or violent offenses, such a system would be of little use in the identification of possible suspects. In Black's case, however, the system would have had a twofold usage. It would have identified Black as a man with convictions for non-consensual sex with young girls, and also have unearthed offenses which he may have perpetrated, but had not yet been linked to. As it was, it emerged only after Black's trial that he was almost certainly responsible for more than the 3 murders for which he was convicted. A serial killer like Black, having killed Susan in 1982 and Carolyn in 1983, is highly unlikely to then leave a gap of 3 years before killing Sarah in 1986, and Susan was unlikely to have been his first victim. At the age of 17, Black had assaulted and left a 7-year-old girl for dead. His first murder was allegedly when he was 35. But the incident in 1967 hadn't left him full of remorse or regret. These were things he told Wire that he knew he should, but could not, feel. When looking back on the event, all he felt was lust. The image of that day reformed again and again in Black's fantasies, and he relived it and improved upon it until it was just right. The compulsion to reenact and refine the experience in reality would have been too deep and overpowering to leave for almost 20 years. In July 1994, a meeting was held in Newcastle to consider the possibility of Black's involvement in similar murders. As well as possible murders in France, Amsterdam, Ireland, and Germany, there were up to 10 unsolved abductions and murders in England which bore Black's MO. April Fabb, who was abducted from her bicycle in Norfolk in 1969. 9-year-old Christine Markham, who was snatched in Scunthorpe in 1973. 13-year-old Jeanette Tate, who disappeared in Devon in 1978. 14-year-old Suzanne Lawrence, who was found dead in Essex in 1979. 16-year-old Colette Aram, who was found strangled. She had non-consensual sex in a field in Nottingham in 1983. 14-year-old Patsy Morris, who was found dead in 1990. And Marion Crofts and Lisa Hessian. The senior officer was quoted in the Express as saying, "We know he killed Jeanette Tate and April Fabb, and we believe that their bodies are buried somewhere in the Midlands Triangle." John Stainthorpe said that, in his opinion, there was an 80% likelihood of Black being involved in the disappearance of Jeanette. Inquiries into these murders have been reopened. Had these abductions and murders been linked at the time to the cases of Susan, Carolyn, and Sarah, the police might have unearthed useful new leads. Had they had a national database, Black might have been identified as a suspect. An enormous amount of fruitless work could have been averted, a quicker conclusion reached, and lives saved.